So last week we discussed escape pods in real-life spaceflight and talked about how astronauts would get down from the space station in the event of an emergency. But I figured today we could talk about the way astronauts would escape during one of the most dangerous elements of flight. Let's talk about launch escape systems and why they are crucial to the safety of crews on vehicles launching into space. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Once again, today we'll be talking about real-world spaceflight, so this is a little bit more distant from the main topics on this channel, but I figured it was a fun little adventure into the real world of space travel. So let's talk about launch escape systems, or launch abort systems. So one of the most dangerous phases of flight, perhaps tied with re-entry and landing, would be the launch, where the spacecraft launches from the surface of the Earth into orbit and then onto wherever it's going. During that phase, the spacecraft is sitting on top of a massive, basically a bomb, a massive quantity of rocket fuel and oxidizer that is a very volatile combination when mixed. Depending on the type of fuel, we could be talking about hypergolics that would ignite on their own if they're mixed. All of this has to pump through incredibly complex and relatively fragile rocket engines that have to perform perfectly, otherwise you get an explosive result. So this is an incredibly dangerous situation. And so you need a way to get crew out of that situation in an emergency. Enter the launch escape system. Launch escape systems generally consist of a tower located above the spacecraft, although that's starting to change with modern spacecraft design. This tower contains usually some small solid or liquid rocket engines that would be ignited to provide an immense amount of thrust and pull the crew capsule away from the vehicle. These were present on most early spaceflight programs from both the United States and the Soviet Union. The sort of tower-based launch abort system, as far as I can remember off the top of my head, was present on Mercury, Apollo, Soyuz, Shenzhou, the Chinese orbital spacecraft, and the new Orion capsule. Meanwhile, other forms, usually mounting those escape engines on the bottom or sides of the capsule, are present on Crew Dragon and the Starliner. The purpose of these systems is simple. They are there to pull the crew away from the spacecraft during a violent deconstruction of the vehicle in one of the most atmospherically intensive periods of flight. So when things are most likely to go wrong during the launch, this system is there to quickly pull the crew away. And it's not a pleasant ride. If crew have to go through an abort, they pull a ridiculous G-load for a very short period of time, enough to cause injuries and bodily harm, albeit not enough to kill a person, but enough to definitely mess you up a bit, and then usually they have a bit rougher of a landing downrange than would be planned. So the launch abort system is present at liftoff, and in most flights it's jettisoned a few minutes into flight, actually before the end of the launch, and there's a reason for that. At a certain point, the atmospheric forces and the atmospheric pressure become low enough that rocket engines on things like service modules and upper stages could be used to propel the crew away, and you don't necessarily need these dedicated high-powered solid rocket motors to pull just the capsule. This is why, if you look at the launch of the SLS, for example, with next year's Artemis 2 mission, the launch abort system is jettisoned shortly after solid rocket boosters are released, which kind of makes sense. The SRBs are a motor you can't turn off, and they provide a lot of thrust, so getting away from a failing SRB is fairly difficult, where if something was to go wrong with the engines on the core stage, you could fire up the engines on the service module and cut the service module loose. That's one of the reasons why the launch abort system actually stays until the service module fairing panels are jettisoned. But throughout history, for most launches, with the exception of the Mercury launches in the very early days when we were still figuring things out, these towers are jettisoned fairly early in the launch process, once you're above the thicker, more dense parts of the atmosphere, where an abort using an upper stage engine would not really be viable. And when you're at a point when you no longer need the tower, you get rid of the tower, because the tower is a fairly hefty chunk of weight on your vehicle, and getting rid of it earlier means you can get more performance out of the rocket you have remaining. But you'll notice when I listed vehicles that had these launch abort systems, it wasn't universal. There are spacecraft that didn't have launch abort systems. There was a trend for a while of trying to build basically fighter jet style ejection seats into spacecraft. The Vostok spacecraft, the first Soviet manned spacecraft, had an ejection seat that worked like a fighter jet ejection seat that would be used during launch in the event of an emergency. And the American Gemini program also had a similar system, an ejection seat that would pull the crew away. There's also a few vehicles that notably had no launch abort system or launch escape system. The most notable one is the shuttle. The shuttle was simply too big and complex to have a system that could split the crew compartment away in the event of an emergency, and we kind of learned the hard way that that's a risk that's not really worth taking. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why I doubt Starship will ever be human-rated, but that's an entire another discussion. So for how dramatically dangerous a rocket launch is and for how many things that can go wrong, it's kind of surprising how few times the launch abort systems have actually been used. Any videos I've used here in this video displaying launch abort systems in action have mostly been from tests, and there have been some pretty dramatic tests. The most interesting test was the in-flight abort test for the Crew Dragon, where they blew up a Falcon 9 mid-flight to test the capsule's ability to perform an abort, which is just crazy. That being said, there are at least 2 times I could think of where there's been an in-flight abort during a launch that resulted in the mission not making orbit. There was one shuttle flight where the engines cut out a bit early and they did an abort to orbit, and the mission basically carried on as planned. But there were 2 launch aborts, both on the Soyuz. The first one happened in 1980, was it 2 or 3, when a Soyuz rocket caught fire on the launch pad, and the crew had to use the launch abort system, the launch escape system, to get away from the burning rocket. It was actually fired from on the pad, which, by the way, I forgot to mention, these launch escape systems can be used basically as soon as the pad infrastructure is away from the rocket. So if there was a problem with the rocket in the final minutes of the countdown, the crew could use this to get away from the rocket on the pad. The other time was actually just a few years ago. It didn't use the launch escape system, though. It had already been jettisoned. During a Soyuz launch, during the separation of the 4 boosters, one of them scraped down the side of the launch vehicle and basically damaged the core stage of the Soyuz rocket, resulting in an abort. Luckily, the crew on the Soyuz were able to use the service module to escape the vehicle and landed downrange. Both crew members were safe. At the end of the day, the launch abort system is a crucial piece of safety equipment before launch and leading up to a few minutes into the flight when the launch abort system is jettisoned. But it doesn't really do you much good in orbit. In fact, it's long gone by the time you make it to orbit. So how do you get back from orbit in the event of an emergency? Well, I'll leave a link up here to a video I made all about how crew would come back from the space station in the event of an emergency using what are basically the real-world equivalent of space-based escape pods. And I'd like you to let me know whether you think it's worth flying a vehicle like Shuttle or Starship that can't feasibly have an abort system, flying manned flights of those vehicles. Or do you think it really is just too risky, seeing all of the potential risks of spaceflight in its current form? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in spaceflight or anywhere in science fiction, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.